think my remarks are actually going to complement Joe's really nicely because they're also about how conservative self-representations of themselves have, in some ways, distorted a richer understanding of the movement that we're all trying to understand. I want to thank everyone in the room as a token of everyone in the conference because I'm deeply flattered and honored to be included in the community of professional historians with my meager 2 years of graduate school and writing for the National Enquirer and all that stuff. It means a lot to me, and I thank you all for it. I get called from time to time by the media to talk about conservative history, and last summer I was contacted by a British radio producer who was doing a documentary on American conservatism, and I said, oh, well, it just so happens I'm going to be in London on vacation in October, and why don't we meet then? So me and my wife met a BBC producer and I think the NPR's London correspondent. And what they did was they outlined kind of what they had in mind for their project. And what I heard them recite was kind of very familiar sort of narrative of what the conservative movement was, is, how it works, how it formed, how it affects present politics. And I think what they were both expecting from me was kind of a politely nodding along. They were just kind of setting up the conversation and maybe some minor embellishments here and there. And I think they were quite shocked that for both me and my wife, what came back to them was a fusillade, saying, it's not like that at all. And I think if I could have recorded that conversation and transcribed it, that would have been a really good presentation for me here today. Because I realized that both from my own ongoing research, my own engagement in contemporary politics, and also, since this is a State of the Field panel, keeping up with the literature, the story is very different from not merely, it's very different from a narrative that, in some sense, I helped contribute to in Before the Storm. So I'll be doing a little self-revisionism here. Conservatives are very, very self-mythologizing and very political. And they have a very self-confident story about what the modern conservative movement is. Even the idea that there's a modern conservative movement is very much a story conservatives tell themselves about themselves. That it started in 1955 with National Review, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every couple of years, a conservative publishes the same book, pretty much. I didn't even mean that as snark, but the latest is Upstream by Alf Regnery. And I haven't read the whole thing, but I guarantee that his contribution to publishing Unlimited Access, an FBI agent inside the White House, which with its made-up stories about marital aids hanging from the White House Christmas tree, isn't in this book. That's not part of the story. It's a story about how intellectuals, sort of nobly bodied forth in their study carols and created a worldly movement to redeem the nation. Nancy and Donald Critchlow's new book is fascinating in that the first half of the book is Donald Critchlow's essay and documents on conservatism from whatever the 50s to the present. And the second half is Nancy's essay and documents on conservatism from the 1950s to the present. And Donald very much kind of recapitulates the standard narrative, which is quite flattering to conservatism. And then Nancy, reproduces, like a letter from, William F. Buckley to, some segregationist leader saying, I really agree with everything you have to say about segregation. It's fascinating to see these sort of two modalities combined, but it's intertwined quite fascinatingly with all of our attempts to understand contemporary politics. So it's part of the story. But I would argue that to the extent to which we take conservatives at their word about their own movement, that's bad historical practice. I mean, Bolshevik meant majority people, and no one went up to Lenin and said, oh, Mr. Lin, just how big a majority do you have? You know, I mean, they were political. Both, you know, the Bolsheviks and the conservatives, deeply political. And when they write about themselves, it's a deeply self-consciously political act. I call it the Committee of 1 Million problem. Some of you might know that Marvin Liebman, the conservative publicist who was very close to the National Review, had a Committee of 1 Million for preventing China entering the UN. And then eventually, sometime along the road, it became the Committee of 1 Million, because he claimed to have had 1 million signatures of people who you know, didn't want China to enter the UN, and claimed that, you know, somewhere in New Jersey, in some warehouse, you know, there are stacks and stacks and stacks of signatures. Now, you know, were there? Probably not. But I think when I think back to before the storm, I might have said that she had 1 billion signatures, right? And Joe said, you know, the narrative that announces that white Southerners are exceptional is not necessarily wrong, but limited. Now, what I'm talking about are things that are, you know, not necessarily wrong, but sometimes are wrong, and always are very limited. Here are the components of the standard story. As again, I, you know, helped recapitulate before the storm. A heroic band of stalwart outsiders bide their time in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. You know, emerged in 1955 to invent fusionism, which is an intellectual movement, you know, combining traditionalism, laissez-faire, and anti-communism. The binding role of anti-communism, avant-garde of brave youth, the New Guard, right? That was the YAF magazine. Have the courage to do what their elders do not, put forward a presidential candidate. The heroic purges of the John Birch Society and the Objectivists, the mobilization behind Goldwater, and the framing of that as kind of year zero of a conservative institution building. A profoundly false notion that the evangelicals were folded into the coalition in reaction to Roe versus Wade. The neocons come and class things up a bit. And all sort of presided over by the notion of an independent conservative movement that's separate from the Republican Party. Yeah, I have another story about this one. When I went to visit a conservative activist named Jameson Campaign, whose father was also named Jameson Campaign, and was a conservative writer for the Indianapolis Star, which is interesting in itself because these generational continuities. I'm not sure there was any generation gap between the two Jameson campaigns, but one, they straddled this 1955 divide. I was just making small talk and I said, "Do you golf?" "I'm a golfer." And she said, "Of course not, I'm a conservative, not a Republican." And that strategy of innocence, of dismissing anything that you don't like as Republican and not conservative, is part of the story too. So just zipping through, I could kind of deconstruct them, point by point. The heroic band of outsiders. I didn't realize till later how often this heroic band of outsiders had their important meetings at country clubs and exclusive resorts. Union League Club in Chicago, a very important. The first meeting of the guys who put together Conscience of a Conservative. Blind Brook Country Club in Greenwich, where Cliff White was one of the founding members, was where the Reagan people met in 1967 and announced they were going to, told Reagan that they were going to try and draft him for president. The 1955 starting point. We all know the famous Trilling point about irritable, there's no conservative ideas, just irritable mental gestures meant to resemble ideas. There's a very rich story to be told about just how sort of profoundly false that was at its movement of utterance, and I can think of two examples. And one is if you read *The Feminine Mystique*, which everyone should read, because it's just great on an analysis of mid-century social science, among other things. She writes about the textbooks on life adjustment that college women would read, and they were as rigid and hierarchical as just about any feudal corporatism, and they were very much rooted in the functionalist sociology of Trilling's own Columbia colleagues.